Greetings adventurers, Delver here. So Wizards of the Coast, the Hasbro subsidiary that owns and publishes Dungeons & Dragons, is gearing up for the release of the game's 6th edition, and to put it mildly, people aren't happy. The first rumblings of discontent came in April of last year when Hasbro purchased the third-party toolset DnDBegone, which was followed in August by the announcement of their OneD&D virtual tabletop. Then, in early December, Hasbro CEO and former WotC president Chris Cox, together with current WotC president Cynthia Williams, said in an investor call that D&D was, quote, under-monetized, and outlined a desire to create a recurrent spending environment akin to those found in video games. Yes, you heard that right. WotC wants to turn D&D into a live service game with microtransactions centered around their own proprietary virtual tabletop. If any of that sounds familiar, it's because that's exactly what they were planning to do with 4th edition, and we all remember how that went. While D&D's 3rd and 3.5th editions were released under the popular Open Gaming license, 4E opted for the much more restrictive Game System license, a license so restrictive and hostile to third parties that basically no one used it, instead opting to stick with 3.5, which led to the creation of Pathfinder, a game that for all intents and purposes replaced D&D for the next 7 years. Unfortunately, it seems WotC learned nothing from 4E's failure, or rather they learned all the wrong lessons, because to go along with their second attempt at 4E's business model, they're also bringing back the GSL, only this time they're trying to frame it as an update to the OGL, and it's not an exaggeration to say that this single move has plunged not just the D&D community, but the entire TTRPG industry itself into absolute chaos. This new version, OGL 1.1, is not only the opposite of an open license, it is quite possibly the most draconian, predatory, and exploitative license to ever exist in the tabletop space. For starters, the new license requires content creators and third-party publishers to register all new and existing material with Wizards of the Coast, as well as report any and all revenue generated. This is because WotC plans to start charging a 25% royalty fee for anyone making more than $750,000 a year, crowdfunding campaigns included. And bear in mind, that's based on revenue, not profits, which is pretty despicable when you consider the microscopic margins third-party publishers operate in, and while $750K may be above what your average self-published homebrewer makes, WotC reserves the right to alter details of the license whenever they feel like it, with only 30 days notice, so it wouldn't be surprising if that threshold gets lowered once they've harvested everyone's sales data. And if all of that wasn't scummy enough already, it gets worse. So much worse. When you publish anything under OGL 1.1, you are forced to grant Wizards of the Coast a permanent and irrevocable license to use your content, for whatever purpose, without credit or compensation. You heard that right, anything you create belongs to WotC, forever. And they don't have to pay you for it or even acknowledge it as your creation. But wait, it gets worse. 1.1 also restricts you to creating role-playing game material in print or static document form only. Publishing your content on a blog is not allowed. You're also not allowed to make computer games, tools, apps, virtual tabletop programs, or material for use with virtual tabletop programs. You're even forbidden from making videos, music, or pantomimes. I don't know what an OGL pantomime even looks like, but it's prohibited. Well, technically it isn't completely off limits, in particular music, art, and videos. However, these aren't covered by the OGL and instead fall under WotC's fan content policy, which, among other things, stipulates that all material must be completely free and also bars you from talking about or endorsing WotC's competitors. So to summarize, third-party publishers and content creators must register all their products with WotC, report all revenue to WotC, and if they make above a certain threshold, pay WotC a 25% royalty. WotC also gets a permanent license to use their content for free and without credit. Non-official video games are prohibited. Tools and apps, like Hero Forge or Path Builder for example, are prohibited. Third-party VTTs, like Roll20, Fantasy Grounds, or The Foundry, are prohibited. And art, music, and video content is only allowed so long as you make no money and don't mention or endorse anything WotC considers competition. situation. But believe it or not, it still gets worse. So far, this all sounds like a pretty raw deal for publishers and fans, but as with 4E and the GSL, there's an easy solution, right? Just forget about OneD&D entirely and continue publishing under the current OGL. Problem solved. Well, unfortunately, that's not an option anymore, because WotC is attempting to revoke the previous version of the OGL, that being version 1.0a, declaring it no longer an authorized license, meaning any OGL content must use version 1.1 after January 13th. And that, fillies and gentlecolts, is what's thrown everything into disarray, because now these draconian, predatory, and exploitative policies aren't just a OneD&D problem, they now retroactively affect 5e, and 3.5e, and Pathfinder, and 13th Age, and Shadow of the Demon Lord, and the OSR, and, well, anything that's ever been published under the Open Gaming license. WotC's intentions are quite clear. They want to control everything. The only D20 system you'll be able to play is OneD&D on WotC's microtransaction-filled virtual tabletop, and the only way to use or publish third-party material will be the DM's Guild, where WotC gets 50% of all sales while also getting to permanently own the creator's work. OneD&D to rule them all and in the license bind them. Or at least, that's their plan anyway. Thankfully, there are a few glimmers of hope. For starters, while I myself am not a lawyer, I have heard from several lawyers, albeit not in an official capacity, that WotC does not, in fact, have the power to revoke a previous version of the OGL. WotC's plan basically hinges on a loophole. Section 9 of OGL 1.0a states that WotC may authorize new versions of the license, and that you are permitted to use any authorized version. Thus, by issuing a new version of the license and declaring the old one no longer authorized, version 1.1 becomes the only legal way to publish OGL material. There's just one problem with that. Well, three problems actually. Intent, precedent, and reliance. You see, back in 2000, when the OGL was initially published, Ryan Dancy, former WotC vice president and, most importantly, co-author of the OGL, wrote an FAQ on WotC's website which clearly states that if WotC ever makes any changes to the OGL that you don't agree with, you are free to use a previous version. It also says that the creation of software and tools is permitted, contrary to WotC's current claim that the license was only ever meant to apply to printed supplements. Furthermore, in response to the controversy, Dancy has gone on record saying that he does not believe WotC has the power to revoke a previous version of the license. He emphasized that no one would have used the license if WotC had been given such a power, and explained that a big part of the lead up to the launch of 3rd edition was convincing third-party publishers that the license wasn't a honeypot. So the intent behind the OGL has been crystal clear for over 20 years, at least until they quietly deleted that FAQ right before sending out NDA'd copies of version 1.1. In addition to that FAQ being on their website for 2 decades, another damning bit of precedent is the fact that, when releasing 4th edition, WotC neither updated nor attempted to deauthorize the OGL, even while Pathfinder was eating their lunch. They didn't do anything about the host of short-lived D20 based games that sprung up in the 2000s either, or the unofficial video games like KOTOR, Solasta, or Knights of the Chalice. There is also the 2003 case of the Book of Erotic Fantasy, in which WotC did revoke the publisher's ability to use the D20 system trademark, but the book itself was still able to be published under the OGL. And then there's the issue of reliance. WotC clearly outlined both the terms of the OGL along with the intent behind those terms, and people built businesses and careers based on the reasonable reliance that WotC was telling the truth. Yet now, WotC is attempting to change those terms via a method they previously stated they wouldn't and couldn't, in a way which will directly harm the people who have been reasonably relying on WotC honoring their legal word. Now, once again, I'm not a lawyer, but frankly, that sounds like a pretty clear-cut case of promissory estoppel. It's all but guaranteed that someone is going to take WotC to court over this, and most bets are on Paizo, possibly alongside Kobold Press and a few others. I'd say the case is pretty ironclad, but WotC does have Hasbro's war chest at their disposal, and corporate litigations are more like a siege than a duel. All it would take is one bad judge, and WotC could lock things up for years while they bleed every challenger dry. Of course, on the flip side, the facts of the case are so clear-cut that a good judge could easily issue a bench ruling and skip the trial altogether. Thankfully, other contingencies do exist outside of the courtroom. For starters, it must be emphasized that you don't technically need the OGL to publish D&D compatible or D&D-like material. Under US law, game mechanics cannot be copyrighted, only the specific expression of those mechanics are eligible for protection. What this basically means, again, not a lawyer, is that the functional rules and systems that underpin D&D can be copied by anyone, but the actual text of the manuals, as well as the names of certain spells and monsters, and generally anything related to story, setting, and lore, are the intellectual property of WotC. The OGL does not give you a license to use D&D's mechanics, because you don't need a license to do that. What the OGL grants is a license to use the system reference document, which is basically a database of all the WotC-owned text from the manuals that pertain to the generic mechanics of the game. What this means is that if you want to publish a subclass for the Ranger, for example, you can simply reference the Ranger's description and abilities as written in the SRD instead of having to rewrite them yourself. Same thing goes for non-original spells, feats, or monsters. Instead of having to write your own description of magic missile, toughness, or kobolds, you can simply point to the SRD instead. The SRD is basically a time-saving tool that lets creators focus on their original content instead of having to re-implement the basic framework every time. What this means for our current situation is that if WotC does indeed revoke the previous/current version of the OGL, the depth of shit any given publisher or content creator will be in is directly proportional to how much they cribbed from the SRD, and thankfully many third-party creators seem to be aware of this. OSR games in particular, being largely ground-up rewrites of older D&D editions or completely original games with entirely unique mechanics, make minimal use of the SRD to begin with. Chris Gonnerman, the creator of Basic Fantasy, has already announced his intention to rewrite all elements borrowed from the SRD and republish the game under a Creative Commons license. Trollord Games and Necrotic Gnome have hinted at similar plans. Matt Colville and Kobold Press have decided to follow in the footsteps of Paizo and create their own systems, while Paizo themselves, having already begun efforts to distance Pathfinder 2nd Edition from D&D, are rumored to be teaming up with Brian Lewis, the other co-author of the OGL, to work on developing their own independent license and SRD. And Frog God Games straight up said they intend to defy WotC and continue publishing under 1.0a, while also throwing their support behind these other independent movements. As heartening as all of that is, though, I still have my concerns, namely how compatible all these different systems from different companies with different licenses will be with each other. On a live stream with Roll for Combat, Ryan Dancy said that one of the problems hurting the TTRPG industry in the 90s, which the OGL was introduced in part to fix, was the issue of games and communities being split into isolated bubbles that only continued to shrink as the games struggled to grow beyond those bubbles. Unless these publishers all pool their resources into a single common SRD, it could easily spiral into a standards war, where you have a bunch of systems that are too similar for any of them to stand out on their own, yet just different enough to cause player confusion and break compatibility. This would essentially be playing right into WotC's hand, as it would effectively neuter their competition and only further solidify D&D's position as the standard for role-playing games. The same can be said about these new licenses as well. Just because a license is open doesn't mean it's compatible with other open licenses. Dancy brought up this point in his interview as the reason why he and Lewis chose not to go with a Creative Commons license. Ultimately, if we do end up with multiple SRDs under different licenses, they would in all likelihood have to be considered unmixable as a legal precaution, which would only serve to further fracture the community. Or at least that's what I was going to say, but then, like Gandalf cresting the hill with the Rohirrim by his side, Paizo came out with one hell of an announcement. First, they stated in no uncertain terms that they do not believe version 1.A can be revoked, citing basically everything I mentioned earlier, not to mention the fact that their own head honchos, owner Lisa Stevens and company president Jim Butler, were leading members on WotC's D&D team back when the OGL was being developed. Furthermore, they're committed to fighting WotC in court if it comes to that. As if there wasn't a solid enough case already, now it's spearheaded by former WotC designers and the lawyer who wrote the damn thing. That pretty much puts it in the bag as far as I'm concerned. But what really set the internet on fire was their contingency plan. Paizo basically summoned the Council of Elrond to put together a new open license completely independent from WotC. This new open RPG creative license is quite fittingly being drafted by Brian Lewis's legal firm Azura Law. It's intended to be system agnostic and explicitly irrevocable, and as an added level of security against company sales and leadership changes, the license won't be owned by Paizo but instead by Azura Law until it's transferred to a non-profit organization at a later date. In addition to Paizo, Kobold Press, Legendary Games, Green Ronin, Chaosium, and several other publishers are already on board with the project. This should hopefully render all questions of license compatibility moot. Rules compatibility is a different story, and we could still be faced with the shrinking bubble problem, but on the other hand, the shared license could also lead to players and publishers trying out more games instead of sticking to just one ecosystem, and I'm sure we'll probably see more than a few cross-system hacks popping up. I guess my only real concern at this point is what the actual terms of the new license will be. A lot of people are making references to GNU and Linux, which has me worried that the ORC license will be modeled on the GPL. One of the biggest strengths of the OGL was its flexibility in allowing publishers to distinguish between open and protected content in their works, thus making it equally viable for use by companies as well as homebrewers. A GPL-style license that forces creators to relinquish all of their rights would, in my opinion, be just as bad as WotC's FOGL. It would essentially force anyone looking to support themselves through RPGs to build everything from scratch, lest they lose all ownership of their work, and would limit third-party supplements to homebrew only. In other words, exactly what WotC wants, just minus the royalties. I'd like to think that all of these tabletop publishers wouldn't craft a license that undermines their own ability to do business, but at the same time, open source is sadly not often the domain of rationality or pragmatism. I guess I can only hope the ORC Council takes an if it ain't broke, don't fix it approach and focuses more on tightening up those loopholes instead of dramatically overhauling the license itself. My own worries aside, I am glad the ORC exists, because WotC have made it clear they have no plans to back down. They've been radio silent throughout most of this fiasco. They cancelled what was probably going to be 1.1's official announcement livestream at the last minute, and even let news of a Paramount Plus series slip out with almost zero fanfare. When they finally did release a statement, it had so much spin and gaslighting I thought I was reading a Jules Verne novel. To give a brief summary, they tried to claim that the leaked version of 1.1 was a draft and that they always intended to solicit feedback, which is BS of course. The license was delivered alongside executable contracts and everyone who received it had to sign an NDA. It was absolutely intended to go into effect on the 13th. The date of the FOGL, which they're now calling version 2.0, going into effect has been pushed back, and they've said that existing material published under 1.0A, including projects still in development, won't be affected by version 2.0 for at least 6 months, and only if the material would be allowed under 2.0 anyway. And you're only actually eligible for this grace period if you signed on and registered under version 2.0. Because of course, WotC is doubling down on revoking version 1.0A, and they reiterated their stance that the OGL was only meant to cover homebrew. That little clause where you grant WotC a perpetual irrevocable royalty-free right to use your content for any purpose is still in there too, even though they straight up try to claim it isn't. And of course, they tried to pretend all of this monopolistic crap is necessary to promote inclusivity and fight NFTs. So basically, nothing has changed whatsoever. WotC even had the audacity to use this piece of Magic the Gathering art as their header image, which comes from a blue counterspell card called Bar the Gate, containing this lovely caption, "The path is closed to you," as if they couldn't get any more brazen and disingenuous. So that's where things are at right now. The lines have been drawn and WotC have chosen this as their hill. Well, to that I say, if the suits at WotC and Hasbro really do see their customers as nothing but obstacles to their money, then let's be as big of an obstacle as we can. I don't normally do calls to action, but in this case I don't think there's any getting around it. I can't tell you what to do with your time and money, nor will I shame you for it, but we have confirmation that WotC doesn't care about how much we complain, only whether it affects their bottom line. So if you feel inclined, I humbly ask that you cancel DnDBegone if you haven't already. Maybe take a break from Magic Arena, boycott the movie and the TV show, and of course don't buy any D&D or Magic the Gathering products until WotC affirms the irrevocability of the real OGL. And remember that WotC is counting on this to blow over like most internet controversies do, so regardless of whether our efforts succeed or not, it's imperative that we, as TTRPG fans, never forget what WotC tried to pull, and never let them forget it either. Just, don't harass their employees. They don't have any more control over this than we do. Hurt the brand and the bank accounts, not the people. Also, don't forget to show those third parties some support. And remember, now's as good a time as any to check out other games as well. Anyway, that'll be it for this video. I'm the Rambling Rune Pony, and I'll see you in the next one. Congratulations, you made it to the end. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss out on future content. If you'd like to support what I do, consider donating to my Ko-fi. It's like Patreon, but better. Link in the description. Anyway, that's all for now. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.